Alright, so we recently got a glimpse of a group called God's Knights, and Dragon said that the real battle doesn't even start until the world government mobilizes them, which is some high praise given that admirals and CP0 have been active this entire time. How strong could they possibly be, and what does mobilizing even mean in this context? It's almost like there's some kind of planning or preparation needed to get them involved, and that actually reminded me of something that happened way back in Thriller Bark, which might not only explain the God Knights, but maybe even a little about Emu's powers and how Shanks and Binks tie together. And no, despite what the thumbnail looks like, I'm not saying Shanks is Emu. It's actually 100 times better than that, and I know it sounds like a lot, but just take a look towards the end of chapter 450 when Absalom summoned the zombie generals to defeat the Straw Hats. Right off the bat, Absalom's shadow looks almost identical to Emu. It's stretched out because of the lighting angle, and even his hat is creating a tall pointed head look just like Emu has. And then most of these zombie generals were just walking suits of armor like knights would be, except one of them happened to be Captain John, who is a famous pirate within his own era, and seems to even be tied to the Rock's pirates. This group that's predominantly made up of knights as well as one famous pirate could tie to the God's Knights, which seem to have a silhouette of a famous pirate from this era being Shanks. And the connection to Captain John goes even a little deeper because Buggy has mentioned trying to find Captain John's treasure, and Buggy and Shanks have been connected for a long time, even feuding over a treasure map that Buggy feels Shanks owes him. Absalom even called these things warriors of ancient times, which is the kind of vibe that I would suspect from God's Knights, who seem to almost be the royal guard of Emu, who has probably been in charge for 800 years now. Also, the generals weren't summoned or mobilized, you might say, until a bit later into the arc when the Thriller Bark crew realized that the Straw Hats were a bigger threat than they expected. That's similar to how God's Knights are seemingly being saved until some certain moment, since Dragon said the battle doesn't start till they get involved. And unlike most of the other zombies on the island, Absalom had to go and awaken these zombies in their own special room basically, which again just reinforces the idea that they are like some special forces that are saved for special occasions. Absalom even noted how they're meant to take out the then current 8 Straw Hat pirates, and while there are 9 total God's Knights now, the crew has grown since then. If you take the 9 Knights plus Emu, that makes for a perfect 10 vs 10 battle versus the Straw Hats. It's almost like these 9 Knights could be Emu's own crew of sorts, which we'll definitely get back to that idea before the end of the video. Also, most of this zombie general stuff happened between chapters 450 and 453, which is pretty much right on the money to being the halfway point to Emu's reveal in chapter 906. And the cover page that followed the introduction of the zombie generals was literally the moon getting blown up, so just take that for what you will. And my friend Tainted Marth mentioned how you could even look at the fact that Absalom has the invisibility fruit as a parallel to how Emu sits on the supposed empty throne, where they rule the world despite being out of sight from everyone. And what is maybe the most pertinent connection to make here is to the wedding that Absalom tried to have with Nami, because this builds a parallel with Vivi, who we basically always see in some kind of elegant dress, and many that could be taken for a wedding dress. I mean, Nami and Vivi were even the main 2 featured girls for this collaboration that One Piece did with a wedding dress designer. And we know that Emu was hunting Vivi as one of the lights that need to be extinguished back near Emu's introduction. You could even look at the broader connections to Christianity in general, because Absalom and Thriller Bark had crosses everywhere, and the world government has a type of cross for their symbol as well. And since all the celestial dragons seem to have saint in their name, that does build a pretty concrete connection to Christianity right there within the world government. And right after Absalom summoned the zombie generals, he was chased by Lola asking him to marry her. Again, just reinforcing this forced marriage theme. I think there's some massive parallels going on here, both about the God's Knights, but maybe even about the bigger picture of One Piece. I mean, the goal of Absalom, Moria, and their crew was to bring back Oars and control him via shadows to probably become Pirate King and take over the world or whatever. They even forced people to stay out of sight from the sun because otherwise they just disappear, and that alone could have some kind of tie to the sun god or how Luffy is bringing the dawn. The connections to Oars are particularly interesting in this regard, but I'll actually might pick back up on this in a future video because I really just want to keep most of this on the God Knight specifically. However, if you want a little preview, go check out Oars' Joy Boy from Marshall D. Preach and this VOD from Randy Troy and I on Theory for Theory. If you watch those, you might see where this is going. And I'll also throw a quick shout out there for One Piece University, who streams every Friday night at 8:30 p.m. EST, 3 Day from the Last Arc channel, Tainted Marth, and Young Usopp for helping me with bits and pieces of this theory, so make sure to go check them out as well. And you know, we're trying to hit 100k around here sometime soon, so subscribing here would be appreciated too. But based off all of these potential parallels that I've laid out so far between the zombie generals and the God's Knights, what can we pull from this information? Well, there are a few main elements to consider about those zombies. 1, they were very old. 2, they fought against their will because of the shadows, and 3, they were considerably stronger than almost every other zombie. If the parallel continues, which of course Oda could invert something when he feels like it, but otherwise, I think these are the 3 things that can really help us think about God's Knights the most. So let's start by discussing their age, because the way I see it, it's safe to assume the existence of the group itself, or the Order of the Knights if you will, has been around as long as the Celestial Dragons since they solved disputes between them. But the individual knights that make up the 9 could either be new people that kind of cycle in and out over time like most military forces do, or maybe they're somehow the same people over the last 800 years and they're either immortal or they're just cyborgs or something that lets them live for this long. They almost have to fall into one of these general buckets, unless it's a mix of the two, which is actually what I believe is going on here. And ironically, Parvision reached pretty much the same conclusion, but through a much different lens, so I feel really confident that something like this could be the case. But as for how I view it, well, we all know there's at least 2 parts to every person, a body and a shadow. Yes, there is a soul or lifespan or whatever as well, but the shadow and the body are more physical manifestations of the person, and we have explicitly seen how important the difference between them is, thanks yet again to Moria and these zombies, particularly Oars. Moria showed us that usually the body controls the shadow, but you can also do the opposite and make the shadow control the body if you have his powers. So what I think could be going on here is that the God's Knights have some kind of shadows from maybe 800 years ago that then inhabit bodies of strong people in the current era. Think how Nightmare Luffy had other people's shadows within his own body that made him so strong he was basically no diffing Oars. I think that same principle could be going on with the God's Knights. They might just be a bunch of nightmare type fighters, except they are controlled by the shadows within them, as opposed to Luffy, who controlled all the shadows that he put in his own body. He still had control where the God's Knights may not. This way, it's kinda like what Moria did with his zombie generals, except instead of putting shadows into a dead corpse, they go into somebody who is alive and already powerful in their own right. And I'm not trying to say that Imu has the same exact power as Moria, but some kind of vastly improved version. And maybe you're thinking that Moria's shadow powers just can't be this important, but keep in mind that Doflamingo was sent to kill him after Marineford, and he even said that the orders came from higher up than Sengoku. His fruit must be really important if that's the case. Plus, Kuma was even sent to go check up on him during the Thriller Bark arc in case he lost. The government seems to be extra careful with this fruit. Plus, Doflamingo controls people against their will much like Moria does, except Moria controls their shadow while Doflamingo controls their physical body. And Dofi is a former celestial dragon, which adds to this whole parallel of Imu controlling certain people. But who could these 9 shadows be that Imu decided to basically recycle them for 800 years? What 9 people would have been so powerful that Imu thought to make them their royal guard, basically? Not to mention that they're strong enough to make dragons say that the battle doesn't start till they're even mobilized. That's some pretty high praise for some people that we haven't met yet. And I think a good person to look at for this is actually Gonfall. Not that he is a god knight, but he was a god of Skypiea and dressed as a knight. So he is a god knight, kind of, but he was the opposing god to Enel, who very obviously has parallels to Imu, from the god aesthetic all the way down to destroying entire islands with lightning or lightning adjacent attacks at least. If Enel had won back in Skypiea, then Gonfall, the literal god knight, would have been forced to either join Enel or just die. Whoever went against Imu in the government long ago probably faced the very same fate. They either had to join or die. And this is actually a theme that a lot lot of villains in One Piece tend to tap into. I mean, Big Mom literally says stay or life, Kaido beats people down and breaks them until they join his side, and even Arlong threatened Nami's village and forced her to work for him. Villains all throughout One Piece have had ways to manipulate even some of their staunchest opponents to join their side, sometimes even controlling them directly via shadows or strings or something like that. And this could be why God's Knights are considered to be so strong, because they were once some of the strongest people of the past that challenged Imu, but then they were forced to switch sides. And I think it makes sense for these shadows to originally have belonged to Joy Boy's crewmates. Once Joy Boy was defeated, Imu probably wanted to take all their shadows because they're extremely strong, and Imu would be able to keep them under their control and remain a secret from the world. It's not like he'd be training or recruiting new crewmates all the time, but he would have his own permanent pirate crew that has to listen to him. Or maybe Joy Boy lost his whole crew to Imu in a Davy back fight, which is all about getting other crews' pirates to join your own crew. And maybe because they wanted to uphold their pirate honor, which would be really ironic in the face of the world government, they agree to have their shadows taken until Joy Boy comes again and wins them back. But whatever the methodology was, there's one issue. If the original bodies that the shadows belonged to were to die, which in this case I think were Joy Boy's crewmates, then the shadows would cease to exist. So unless Joy Boy's crew was kept alive for 800 years, these shadows should have disappeared by now. And that's where we have to take a visit back to the freezer. The freezer with the giant straw hat in Marijois. This has been a mystery that's plagued the One Piece community since Oda randomly threw it to us, but I think this could be a huge clue to why the shadows have persisted for so long. The Straw Hat Chamber may be what it is because Joy Boy actually died, and all Imu has is the hat and not the body. And again, I really implore you all to go check out this VOD from Randy Troy and I, because it just fits in too well. And if I start talking about it, the video is going to be 45 minutes plus, so please just go check that out because it's just too good. But Joy Boy's crewmates' bodies might be in those other chambers that are adjacent to the Straw Hat one. I mean, there was a whole row of those things, but Imu only went into the one with the Straw Hat. So if Joy Boy's crew was frozen in those other rooms, then their shadows would theoretically be around forever. I mean, yes, freezing would actually kill you in real life, but this is fiction, and cryogenically sending people to the future and such is a super common theme. And we were just told that Saul didn't actually die from the ice time capsule, so I think it's a legitimate possibility. So this would mean that Imu would have these knights at their disposal for almost eternity, as long as nobody thaws or hurts those bodies, or intervenes when moving the shadow to a new body. And that takes us to Shanks and God Valley. Everyone has been talking about him in regards to these knights because of that silhouette in the middle, which regardless of whether my theory is true or not, or anyone else's theories for that matter, I think it's clear that Oda wants us to tie that image to Shanks. It's the only one that's shown in full, he's in the center, and it just looks identical to Shanks. It's clearly meant to provide some type of hint to the reader, whatever that hint is. And at first I was very resistant to the idea that Shanks could be a God's Knight because obviously he's supposed to be a good guy, and how would a pirate ever get to rule over disputes between celestial dragons, especially one that sailed with the Pirate King no less. But at the same time, Shanks did get to sneak into Marijois and talk to the Gorosei like it was no problem, and film read hints that he may have some connection to a Figureland family. So I thought maybe Shanks' dad was a God's Knight, or Shanks is a clone of one, or maybe Shanks' sword just belonged to one. But no, I think Shanks was meant to become a God's Knight at God Valley by having one of these shadows imbued into him, but he was rescued. Basically, I think he probably still does have that shadow in him, but something happened that ruined Imu's layer of control, at least for the time being. Maybe there's gonna come a moment in the future when Imu has a chance to regain control, and maybe Shanks even knows that's coming. It could be kind of like a Shadow Asgard moment from Moria if we continue all these zombie parallels from Thriller Bark. The reason the Gorosei treat him the way they do might be because they need him alive so they can use him later on. Maybe Rox had Moria's fruit or something back then and somehow screwed up Imu's plans while transferring the shadows. Or if we want to make yet another tie to Dressrosa and Doflamingo, it could be like what happened with Sugar and Kyros. Maybe Imu needs to make a contract of sorts after the God's Knights receive their shadows, but Shanks was interrupted, so he's been a free spirit of sorts this whole time. I mean, Kyros is a one-legged swordsman, and Shanks is a one-armed swordsman, but Shanks doesn't even hold a candle to Kyros when it it comes to being a dad, let me tell you. And shout out to 3-Day from the last arc for mentioning that the 9 shadows that Toki spoke about in Wano could be the same 9 shadows that I'm proposing reside within God's Knights. I mean, it sure seemed like this prophecy was about saving Wano, but we never really touched back on this and clarified who those 9 shadows were. I mean, sure, you might be able to infer that they're the scabbards, but it is just a little strange that it never came back up after the fact. And maybe the Knight woven of 20 years is actually the Knight that Imu can take back control of Shanks and maybe even the other God's Knights. I mean, Toki said directly, "You are the moon, unaware of the dawn," and with Luffy emulating the sun god, Imu having some kind of tie to the moon kind of makes sense as well. Maybe this night is some kind of eclipse or something like that, where Imu can then again resume total control, so there will soon come a time where Shanks is forced to fight on the enemy's side, much like the general zombies did. I think you could even find a connection to CP0 here because of what Guernica said to Drake during the raid, where Drake said he was chasing his own sense of justice, and Guernica said that he was envious. This almost hints that there's some loss of free will involved with being in CP0, and since there's some of the top agents of the world government, that kinda lines up, I think. I mean, it's hard to imagine Shanks ever being evil, but this angle would set up a situation where he literally doesn't have a choice but to fight for the bad guys. Despite how strong Shanks is, he would be fighting the will of Imu and whoever shadow resides within him, and that shadow may have belonged to Joy Boy's crew. And if I had to guess which crew member it was, I think it would be Joy Boy's right-hand man, the vice captain of the original Joy Boy. And the more I think about it, I bet that person is Binks. I've mentioned before how Shanks and Binks both end in the same kanji, being Kusu, and Rocks also ends with this kanji, by the way, and Shanks said that the best sake he ever had is from his hometown, and Binks' sake is obviously one of the most popular songs in pirate history. Plus, Shanks loves to drink, which fits in nicely. And going back to the zombie generals one more time, Captain John is a good parallel for Shanks here, and he was drinking the second he opened the coffin. You could almost think of Shanks like Shadow Binks, and if you merge the names, it literally creates the name Shanks, meaning Shanks may have been going around with the shadow of Binks influencing him at least somewhat for the last 30 plus years. Even Nightmare Luffy was influenced by the weak shadows within him. I mean, he literally used a sword, which is crazy for him. So Shanks has probably been influenced too, thus giving him an extreme boost in strength, but also influencing some of his actions in the world. And maybe that is the reason he bet his arm on the new era. He needs someone to be stronger than him in the future, or else the world doesn't have a chance. He may know that there will come a day where he actually has to fight Luffy and he won't be able to hold back, and with the power of Binks or whoever in Joy Boy's crew behind him, Luffy would literally need to surpass almost everyone to have a shot. That may even tie to what Roger told Shanks that made them cry, and made Shanks decide to postpone chasing the One Piece. Imagine if Roger said something like, "One day, Shanks, you're gonna turn on everyone, but it's not your fault." It could be something like Rebecca and Viola when Doflamingo was controlling them, and Viola kept telling her it won't be her fault. Even similar to when Doflamingo controlled King Riku, who slaughtered his entire kingdom. Even though these people technically did it, it isn't really their fault, and that's why Shanks didn't want to get the One Piece. On one hand, Imu would then be controlling someone who knows where it is or even has it in their possession, which makes the situation all that much worse, but also, Shanks might have been smart enough to realize that he's better off helping someone become stronger than him and defeat him than anything else, because if Shanks ever wants to be freed from the shadow residing within him, he would need to lose and to have the shadow removed. Would that require killing him first? Maybe. Or maybe it requires Blackbeard getting involved. Maybe Shanks ends up having his shadow, or Binks' shadow to be precise, taken by Blackbeard, who then uses it to his own advantage. I mean, he has the darkness fruit already, he tried to recruit Moria, and there should be S. Gecko with shadow powers somewhere on Egghead, so I think it's a legit possibility. But alright guys, that wraps it up for this one. If you enjoyed it, please hit like and subscribe, and maybe even check out one of these two videos that you should probably already see on the screen. Later.